Last night, which was the third night of the Gorge, was the holy grail for me. I've got the Languedoc guitar, and that is just set in stone. I love it. And the one that I love most with Fish is the Koa #1, which is the 96. So that was the one that was on stage for Big Cypress. So that's set. But everything along the signal chain I've obsessed over. When I started the band, I went and bought a mid-80s tube amp, the Mesa Boogie, and I got this Ross compressor, and I kind of built my sound around that, right?
Right.
Somewhere a few years ago, I decided that I wanted to step up my game, and amps are kind of like cars. Like a 67 Camaro is different than a 87 Camaro.
Sure. Sounds different, feels different.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of my tone was built in the early stages through signal processing instead of through amp saturation. So all my heroes, every tone-wise, tonal heroes, Carlos, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Jimi Hendrix, Clapton, Jerry, all of them, when those guys went and bought an amp, it was 1967, and they bought a 67 Camaro. So, Jerry used a black bass Fender, Jimi Hendrix used a Marshall that was hand-wired, by Jim Marshall. Shortly after that era, rock and roll became huge, and every music store in America wanted to have a Marshall amp like Jimi Hendrix used. So they started mass producing them, and the same thing happened to every product that has ever happened. Once it became mass produced, the parts they started using were cheaper, the grill cloth, the glue on the cabinets, everything. So tonal qualities of guitar went down the tubes. The other thing that happened was that tube technology, which was cutting edge at the time, shifted to like Chinese and Russian cheap transistors and resistors and capacitors that started finding their way into these store-bought amps. What my new amp rig is I did incredible amounts of research and sonic testing on this stuff, but I have an old new stock Comet amp that was designed by this guy Ken Fisher in the 80s, and he's a guy who collected all these old resistors and capacitors and stuff like that, right? And designed these beautiful amps that are very, very simple and very, very clean. They're stainless steel with, solid gold pots and big old American resistors.
Okay.
A lot of this stuff was almost like Kodak film. You had to collect it. So I have a low serial number Comet 60 that was actually designed by Ken Fisher, who's like an amp guru. The great thing about these amps is that you can change the tubes. So I have one that has Philips 6L6 tubes in it, and all the preamp tubes were hand-picked. And I tried every different kind of antique preamp tube in every position until I found the tone that I wanted. The other amp has British Mullard EL34 Marshall tubes, basically. What happened was when I was doing the trio tour, since it was a power trio, I started leaning on this Marshall sound.
Chunkier.
Big, thicker, chunkier, British, rock.
Yep.
Almost like, Funk 49 era, Badfinger, that, those sounds are so good.
Right.
Because these amps were like hand-built, handcrafted, like I said, like an old car. Mm-hmm. Everything was steel and resistors, and today there's transistors and plastic chips and crap in there, right? So when I shifted back to Fish at Lake Tahoe, I had kind of gotten used to this Koa #2, which is a thicker sound, and leaning on this Marshall sound because I had just been doing the trio tour.
Right, it was fresh.
Right? So I kind of gotten in the habit. It took me till the first night of the Gorge to kind of go back, this is Fish, to go back to my Koa #1. And then I still have that Ross compressor sound. So everything going through the chain is virtually the same as it always has been. The only big change sonically, well, there's sort of two, is one, it's really a much better amp than the Boogie Mark III that I had. I hadn't been using that amp for years anyway. I was using a 67 Fender Deluxe for a lot of years. And then I went to this Bogner, and I was trying to find the amp that I'm on now. I love this amp. It's incredible. The second night of the Gorge was almost all classic 90s Trey sound, but with the Comet amp. So this is it's a Fender-based amp circuit, Ken Fisher designed, Philips 6L6s, and I still use the Ross compressor and the two tube screamers like I always did, and the same guitar. So I could really access the Reba, the squirming coil sound.
Right.
The third night was when I got it all to come together where I could paint with all the different colors, and I was going back and forth all night long between the classic 6L6 sound, boom, like to the clean, uncompressed Fender sound to the Marshall. I was so happy to finally have been able to unravel that mystery.
And now transitioning technically super easy for you to go back and forth?
That's the big trick. So I had this new Bradshaw rig design that I worked on with Bob. But since I've gotten it, my new guitar tech and I have been working on making it fluid and user-friendly. It's trickier than you might think, so that my main sound is completely clean. There's nothing in between there. That was the other problem that I used to have. I used to run through a lot of effects, so I was getting some gray soup, my clean sound.
Right.
And when I did fairly well, I sort of was listening to some of these old tapes. It's like, why is that so clean? It's so clean,
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Again, this is a long, boring answer for anybody who doesn't care
Not
about
boring,
this
Trey. We care about it. We're here for it.
I also switched to this situation where I'm using like a high impedance situation. It allows me the signal to do a longer run without losing any high end or anything. Because you have to go, in order to access all those effects, you have to go through a fair distance of cable.
Okay.
So now I have Bob built this as a high impedance, and there's a knob that I can, if the tone changes, I can adjust the amount of impedance from low to high. I now have, the whole chain from start to finish is really top quality, and I can instantly access. If I'm doing a song like Fluffhead, I'm right back to that sound, especially when I'm on cover number 1. But if you listen to Twist or something from the Third Night, that Muller DL34 screaming, there's nothing like it. Last comment, when you push an amp with those kind of high quality parts and the really great tubes, like the really good ones, like in my Boogie, I used to have these Savtech Russian tubes. These Muller DL34s are so much better. It's all the harmonics, and it's all being created in the saturation of the tube, not with effects, not with tube screamers and stuff like that. I mean, tube screamers were designed to recreate that sound. So now I'm getting that sound in the organic way. So this is why a guy like Derek Trucks doesn't use any effects, no reverb, nothing, because he's so intent on getting that gorgeous tone that he gets. I mean, to me, he has the greatest tone. His tone is just...
You can hear his hands.
Yeah, and I wanted that, but I also want all the effects. So I theorize that I have gotten there, that I'm there.
Boom.
That I can get exactly the completely pristine signal path. The other trick was that I wanted to be able to access reverb and delay. If you put reverb and delay in the beginning of a signal chain, you end up amplifying the reverb and delay, and you end up with gray soup. Again, that's why most people's tones suck.
It's a wash.
It's a wash. So I have these ambicabs now. My signal goes from my guitar down a really top quality cable into a beautiful amp where every preamp tube and our antique, old new stock, straight into a 112 speaker and then out to the house. Just as clean, just exactly the same as Derek. After that 12-inch speaker, it goes through another loop into 2 8-inch speakers, and that's where my reverb exists. And I have 2 cabinets, and we put the reverb far away so that the 2 mics don't get cross-referenced. They're not bleeding into each other.
Okay.
That was also at the Gorge. We figured that out because we were getting some bleed. Now I've got so when I'm standing there, I've got like my clean sound coming out of this 12, and then I've got the reverb coming out of my right ear, so it's like stereo. And when I switch amps, it goes like that. It's the coolest thing. It sounds so cool. But anyway, Gary has the reverb and echo on a fader, and it's clean sound, is pristine. So I think I have best of both worlds now. And the Bradshaw system I can access like a complete color palette. Just boom, 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 boom. Tube vibrato, univibe, octaves, backwards, forwards. It's all in there.
And where does the Leslie come into play?
Oh, and the Leslie, that's another huge step forward. I love that Leslie. I could never quite get the Leslie thing to work, and now I got a new Leslie, and I'm using it all night long. Essentially, I have 3 amps, okay? All foot switchable, right? I got the Fender, the 6L6 Fender type circuit that I can combine with the compressor to get the exact 94 Trey sound, right? Boom, but a little better because they're better tubes. Then I can switch over to the British power tube Jimi Hendrix type sound on a dime, boom, 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 like in the middle of a phrase.